Do you remember being this old? What kind of things did you like to do? What was your favorite food? Who took care of you and made you feel comforted in times of fear? Now, what would you have done if at this age strangers came into your home and took everything and everyone you knew away from you? You were told everything you've known and enjoyed was wrong and no longer allowed. If you searched for familiarity, you were punished. How would you have felt then, and how would you feel now? How would you have felt if perhaps you were not taken, but this was the fate of your little sister or brother? How would you handle knowing they had faced this trauma? This is the reality of residential schools. This is the fear and heartache the Indigenous community face. The environment around us is closely linked to our mental health, with the quality of the environment directly impacting it and potentially causing psychological trauma like depression, suicide, and autism. Studies show that survivors of residential schools experience mental health problems such as PTSD, drug addiction disorder, and significant depression and dysthymia, with some arguing that this creates residential school syndrome. Attendance at these schools have been linked to poor mental health well-being, distress, and suicidal thoughts and actions. Survivors of residential schools are more prone to physical and mental health issues, reporting higher levels of depression, suicidal ideation attempts, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. With such a high prevalence of mental health issues, the Indigenous community has seen a growth in suicide rates of not just survivors, but the individuals still fighting the trauma their own families have experienced. Stats Canada conservatively reported 1,845 Indigenous Canadians have ended their lives between May 2011 and December 2016. Suicide rates are 3 times higher in Indigenous Canadians, and these rates are most prevalent in youth and young adults in the 15 to 24 age range and are more significant in the female population. Studies have demonstrated that geographic and socioeconomic factors, especially household location and level of income, labor force status, marital status, and level of education account for the excess risk seen in the Indigenous population, but this does not exclude other risks such as food security, racism, social exclusion, employment, and healthcare.
The individuals who have not made the difficult decision to end their life are still suffering, looking for strategies to cope, and these are often not the healthiest, safest methods. The residual impact residential schools have had across generations has been shown to be similar and sometimes identical to the residential school survivors themselves. Indigenous individuals suffering turn to substances such as opioids, methamphetamine, and alcohol as an easier way to cope instead of seeking professional help. For instance, in 2020, in Keswick's First Nation of Saskatchewan, 12 Indigenous people died from an opioid overdose. And in just January of 2021 alone, another 6 overdoses were reported. There have been signs of progress seen in some individuals living on reserves. However, more research is required to determine what methods are most successful. Survivors are not only battling their own trauma and addiction, but they are also battling their academic motivation. Through residential school implementation, Indigenous culture, tradition, and languages were destroyed and were replaced by Eurocentric ways of living and functioning in society. This has misshaped the Indigenous perception of post-secondary institutions as violent, discriminatory, silencing, and belief-denying. Today, we see that residential schools have led to post-secondary education barriers such as institutional, geographic, and financial barriers. The Canadian Census of 2006 reveals 40% of Aboriginals between ages 20 to 24 have not completed high school, thus making access to further post-secondary education limited. Due to the location of Indigenous communities, relocation to unfamiliar urban cities for education is often required and can be very tough to mentally and emotionally manage. This can place Indigenous students at a higher risk for depression and subsequent withdrawal from education. Many Canadians may be under the impression that all Indigenous peoples receive free tuition for post-secondary education, and this is not true. The band funding distribution system requires students to record a certain number of class hours, which in many cases does not guarantee student tuition, living, and expense funding, thus the incompleteness of their post-secondary studies. Further work is needed to level the playing field for these bright minds. One of the most prominent phrases that has been heard across Canada in more recent years has been the rallying cries of Every Child Matters while donning an orange t-shirt. This movement was founded in 2013 by Phyllis Webstad of Setwakam Katkatum First Nation in BC, and she is a residential school survivor taken from her grandmother at just 6 years old. The day she was taken, she was stripped of everything she had known, even the clothes off her back, which happened to be an orange shirt. On May 27, 2021, news stories broke across the country reporting the discovery of 215 unmarked graves found in Kamloops, BC, of children from residential schools. After the Kamloops report, additional graves were discovered in several other residential school locations, and the marching began. This sparked the long overdue conversation of what the Indigenous community has gone through, and on June 3, 2021, Canadians received notice that Bill C-5 had received royal assent declaring September 30th as a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, a day for the country to continue learning the tragedies that have taken place in Indigenous history and to honor the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis community survivors. As of May 24, 2022, the National Memorial Register has confirmed the names of 4,130 children whose lives were taken by the hands of residential schools, but these children's lives have impacted thousands more. So the next time you wonder why something from the past like residential schools still matters today, think of her. The journey of reconciliation has only just begun.